I hope, meaningful and deep interaction around some really important issues in our society today. We are looking at a really critical issue. And before I say that, let me just say welcome to the Zehr Institute. And this is one of our regular webinar series. And we're entitling this Reimagining and Restoring Justice toward a Truth and Reconciliation Process to Address Violence Against African Americans in the United States. You know, this subject is broad, and so we wanted to bring it right down into some of the issues that are clearly emerging in new strength, maybe, and in a new familiarity. Just because they're appearing more on the media does not necessarily mean that this hasn't been a historical issue for many, many years. But we're hearing more about it in the media. We're hearing about it more in politics, and so we felt like this is a really critical juncture in which we can start talking about what do we do with the crisis that we're in. And I think for many of us, we never imagined the momentum that would be around this idea of a national truth-telling process in this country, in the United States. And so we want to open that conversation up, and I hope open up your imagination to think about the possibilities of where that could take us. And I can't think of a better person to help us in that discussion than Dr. Fania Davis. And I just want to say a little bit about Fania Davis as a way of background for those who may not be as familiar with her work. She's someone known nationally, and we'll discuss more of her heart and her passion. Dr. Fania Davis is the co-founder and executive director of Restorative Justice for Oakland Youth. Coming of age in Birmingham, Alabama, during the social ferment of the civil rights era, the murder of two close childhood friends in the 1963 Sunday school bombing crystallized within Fania a passionate commitment to social transformation. For the next decade, she was active in the civil rights, Black liberation, women's, prisoners, peace, anti-racial violence, and anti-apartheid movements. After receiving her law degree from the University of California, Berkeley in 1979, Fania practiced almost 27 years as a civil rights trial lawyer. During the mid-1990s, she entered a PhD program in Indigenous Studies at the California Institute of Integral Studies and apprenticed with traditional leaders around the globe, particularly in Africa. Since receiving her PhD in 2003, Fania has been engaged in a search for healing alternatives to adversarial justice. She has taught restorative justice at San Francisco's New College Law School and indigenous peacemaking at Eastern Mennonite University, our Center for Justice and Peacebuilding, and the Summer Peacebuilding Institute. She writes and speaks on these subjects broadly and is in demand internationally. The search for healing justice also led Fania to bring restorative justice to Oakland. In addition to being the current executive director of RJOY, Fania also serves as on the council of the serves as the counsel to the International Council of 13 Indigenous Grandmothers. She recently received the Ubuntu Award for Service to Humanity. Fania's research interests include exploring the indigenous roots, particularly the African indigenous roots of restorative justice. Fania is a mother of 2 children, a dancer, and a practitioner of yoga. And more than that, Fania embodies the passion and compassion that she's so clearly articulating as she gives us a vision for what the future of this country could look like if we could engage in an honest, powerful, truth-telling and healing justice process. So welcome, Fania.
Thank you, Carl.
And I wonder if you could just start us by sort of launching. You've made a number of public appeals, and you've written on the web and in various sites where there's been a lot of reading, blogging, and so on around this call for a national truth-telling process here in this country, specifically around violence against African American communities. And I wonder if you can just tell us a little bit about what that call means in your mind and heart.
Okay. Briefly, it means that, all of these killings that we're learning about now, that have been exposed to a lot of international media coverage, but killings that have been going on historically since the beginning of this nation. The killings of Mike Brown, of Eric Garner, of Trayvon Martin, of Sandra Bland, of Freddie Gray, and on and on and on. We are learning about these things more because it's being covered in the media, and we are responding with this great need for justice. There's this yearning for the killings to stop. There's this yearning to hold those responsible accountable. And we look to the criminal justice system for that justice. And if the criminal justice system refuses to indict, or if they indict and if it refuses to convict, we feel that there has been no justice. It's my view that even if officers or others who have killed Black youth, like George Zimmerman, even if they are indicted, and even if they are actually convicted, which is very unusual, as we know, that is not going to really stop the killings. And that is because all of this racial terror that we are seeing exposed to the light of day is really rooted in the original wound of this nation, the original trauma, and that is the trauma of slavery. And even though slavery no longer exists legally, that racial terror and the racial trauma that is the essence of slavery is continuing to re-enact itself. And so we abolished slavery, and that was replaced by Jim Crow, and that was replaced by convict leasing, and today, and sharecropping. And today, that racial terror has morphed into deadly police practices and mass incarceration. So my view is that we need to think about justice in a completely different way. How do we envision and imagine a justice that can interrupt these historical cycles of racial trauma? How do we transform these historical harms so that the killings can stop? How do we view accountability? How do we hold systems accountable? Because our justice system only knows how to hold individuals accountable. The problem is that this racial terror that we're seeing is not an individual problem.
That's right.
It's a systems problem. It's an historical problem. And our criminal justice system has no idea how to hold systems accountable. So these are the thoughts that I have had, which have led me to believe that the only way that we can really stop these killings and interrupt these historical cycles of racial terror and trauma is to engage in a national truth-telling and racial healing and transformation process. I'm actually using the language of the Kellogg Foundation's initiative, which we'll talk about.
Right. Thank you. I mean, that's incredible. And there's a lot of questions that just jumped out of that. And I hope we can get into that as we start this discussion. But maybe back up a little bit and just help us understand the pulse that you have from your own experience and background. I mean, it's a fascinating one from a civil rights lawyer, well, growing up in Birmingham and experiencing the civil rights, and then an activist lawyer, and then a PhD in Indigenous justice. Yeah. Tell us a little bit about that journey.
Okay. So, Carl, I was born in, you said Birmingham. We say Birmingham.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. Birmingham, Alabama. Mm-hmm. The church bombing, like the one that we saw in Charleston not that long ago at the Emmanuel Church, was something that happened all the time. in Birmingham or Birmingham, Alabama, when I was growing up. Any church that was involved in the civil rights movement was a target for racial terror. And I was born, Carl, atop Dynamite Hill. That was the name of my neighborhood. And it was called Dynamite Hill because Black families like ours had moved into this previously all-white neighborhood. And the response, unfortunately, of some whites, was violence and terror and bombing. In fact, our father joined other fathers in the neighborhood and armed themselves to defend themselves against this racial terror by the White Citizens Council and the Ku Klux Klan. And my church that we went to had interracial meetings, and our church was burned. And then the house across the street from our church, which was a house of lawyer Arthur Shores, attorney Arthur Shores, who was one of the leading civil rights lawyers of the time. His home was bombed, and many, many other bombings occurred in Birmingham, Alabama. And one that affected me really personally was the Birmingham Sunday School bombing, September 15th, 1963, where two of my close friends, Carol Robinson and Cynthia Wesley, were killed. And, so all of these experiences in the South, walking out the door and walking into hostile territory when you went downtown, and it was a childhood where the pervasive social messaging was that you're inferior, you're subhuman because of the color of your skin, and you can't drink out of this nice water fountain because of the color of your skin. You have to drink out of the colored one, which isn't refrigerated, which isn't cooled, and you've got to go to this substandard bathroom, and you can't go to the amusement park, and you can't go to the swimming pool because you're Black. So, growing up in this state of apartheid, basically, and during this reign of racial terror, I would say imbued in me this just really deep yearning to be a powerful agent of social change. And so, in other words, I think it put me on the quest of being a warrior for social change. Mm-hmm. And so when I left the South, Carl, I became involved in almost every movement of my time and of the latter half of the 20th century, starting with the civil rights movement as a child, and then going on to the Black student movement when I went away to college. Mm-hmm. And then the Black nationalist movement. I went through a very intense anti-white stage. I remember I think about 1965 or so, my brother had enrolled in the National Guard, and we were coming home for Christmas, as all of the children do. I have three siblings, and we all had gone away to school by that time. So we were coming back home for the holidays, and I was at home, and my brother drove up, and he had a white man in the car with him. They were both in the National Guard. And I was very angry with my brother for bringing this white person to our home. And I literally stood in the doorway of my house, to keep him from coming in. So I kind of went through that in reaction, to the racial hatred and terror that I experienced. Went through a Black nationalist stage, and became involved in movements, became involved in anti-imperialist movements, anti-capitalist movements, women's movements, anti-war movements, the anti-apartheid movement, economic justice movement, and others. I was just literally on this path, this warrior path. And when I was in my early 20s, my husband and I were very active with the Panthers in San Diego, and our home to by police armed, who pulled their guns and almost killed my husband. I actually jumped on the back of the police officer who had pulled out his gun and knocked his arm so that the bullets, instead of going into my husband's body, went up the wall of our house. And one bullet did catch my husband, and he fortunately survived without any residual injury. And then my sister, shortly after that occurred, by the way, we were acquitted ultimately, or actually the charges were dropped. We never went through a trial. But there was a massive movement supporting us, and a judge that continued to drop the charges, saying that the attack against us was politically motivated, that the officers had no business in actually charged attempted murder of police officers. But those charges were ultimately dropped. But shortly after that happened, my sister faced capital murder, kidnapping, and conspiracy charges, and was on the 10 most wanted list for several months before she was captured in October of 1970. And I became very involved in her international movement to free her. And then after her case, I became a trial lawyer fighting racism in the courtroom. So I was fighting race against racism, fighting against sexism, fighting against capitalism, until I reached a point in the mid-90s where I felt completely out of balance and intuitively knew that I needed more healing and spiritual energies in my life. And so I shut down my law practice, and serendipitously I was led to this PhD program in indigenous healing wisdom out of the California Institute of Integral Studies. And I did that for about 7 years, and I had the opportunity of working with healers all over the world, especially in Africa. Got my PhD, and then couldn't get a job doing this wonderful healing work, that I wanted to do. I couldn't get paid for it, right? To pay my students. So I ended up kicking and screaming, going back into the practice of law. It was really interesting, though, because my first client, when I went back into the practice of law, was an initiated man from Africa, from the Sudan. I've been denied tenure at the California State University, East Bay. I talked about him as an initiated man, and warrior locks, which we know, and he had warrior marks. And so I was able to bring some of that, some of my knowledge from having done all of the work in indigenous healing into the courtroom. In fact, we won the case, and in fact, one of the jurors said, "Miss Davis, I thought you were going to break out and dance in the courtroom there for a minute." And I said, "Well, that's the way it's done traditionally. It's justice involves dance, it involves music and healing." So I wasn't able to immediately do this healing work, as I said earlier, but I'm glad I did go back into the practice of law, because it was through an invitation by lawyers to come to lawyers that I learned about restorative justice. And once I learned about it, I really experienced an epiphany. I said, this is justice that seeks to heal harm instead of add to the harm. This justice that seeks to create social peace instead of deepen social conflict. This justice that is a healing, a battleground. This integrates the lawyer, the healer, and me. I can be all of these things at once. So it was a pivotal moment in my own evolution. Spiritually and in every way.
Wow.
And and from your question was to talk about my own personal journey and how that journey led me to make this call that I'm making today for truth and reconciliation process to address racial violence against African Americans in this country. So Once restorative justice, this healing justice, I began working in Oakland, California.
Mm-hmm.
And I learned that the restorative justice movement at that time, which was about 35 years into the international restorative justice movement, I learned that there was a dearth of literature and conversation and consciousness about racial justice within the restorative justice movement, which was very disturbing for me.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, something that was so important to me because I am a racial justice activist, and that was like 50 years of my life, and I felt so I felt that restorative justice was so resonant, and I felt passionate about it when I learned about it. Then later to discover that there was no real race consciousness in that movement was very, very, very surprising and disappointing. But we immediately began to think in Oakland about how we could change it. And we attended a couple of national conferences, and some people, African American people, especially in the restorative justice, national restorative justice movement, had the same ideas that I did. And we convened the conference in 2013 on the subject of race specifically.
Mm-hmm.
It was called Keeping It Real, Race and Restorative Justice.
Mm-hmm.
And I invited Angela, my sister, Angela Davis, and Erica Huggins, who's a Panther leader, and Tim Wise, who's a white anti-racist, and many others, Native Americans, to speak at that conference, which was solely dedicated to racial justice and restorative justice. First time ever in the history of the restorative justice movement that racial justice activists came together with restorative justice activists. And that was a pivotal moment in the history of the restorative justice movement. Because how can we have a movement that purports the criminal justice system if it does not address the issue of race, given that people of color are the ones who are most harmed by the criminal justice system. So to not address race gives the impression that of callousness, gives the impression that is an oppression, sort of an exclusivistic impression that really is at odds with the fundamental inclusive assumptions that are related to restorative justice. Mm-hmm. So we're happy to report that this has really changed, since the time that I became involved in the restorative justice movement. We've had on the subject of race, more national conversations on the subject of race. And the last national conference on restorative justice, which was in Florida, was just beautiful. Almost a majority of people of color, and every plenary addressed race, either explicitly or implicitly. Mm-hmm. Race, gender, LGBT issues, gender orientation issues. So I'm really happy with that. But back to the question of the truth and reconciliation model. I talked earlier about how I personally came to think that, especially with all of the international publicity around police killings, that we needed to think about and envision and imagine a more capacious justice, not a justice that simply looks backward in time and blames and punishes and end of story, but a justice that is more forward-looking, that asks, how can we tell the truth, first of all, about what has happened? How can we promote accountability for the harms that have occurred? And how can we transform relationships and transform social structures, moving forward into a future that is utterly different from this racially fractured present and past that we are caught up in right now? Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Fania. That's profound, and there's a lot of really important bits that are leading to this place where we're having this conversation now, and that's very, very exciting. I want you to, I mean, there's a lot of questions coming, and I'll just jump. Maybe what we could do is pull back a little, because I'm imagining some who are here, I'm hoping, are wondering, what would a national truth-telling process look like in a country like the United States? So big, so spread out, so diverse, and in light of the political climate, I mean, there's a, how would we step into that space? And that's where we're going to take this conversation, I hope. But maybe a little bit before we do that, one of the things I thought might be important is for us to give a bit of an overview of the reconciliation processes internationally. And Fania, I hope you can jump in from your experience with South Africa and wherever else too. But I think it's important for some of the precedent. This is not new to the context. Here in the States, though, we've had some local truth commissions, the most be Greensboro in North Carolina. There have been other efforts that I'm not as familiar with. But internationally, this process of truth and reconciliation has really taken hold in war to peace transitions in many different regions and countries of the world. And particularly, I mean, we could go back as far as maybe, I think in some ways we need to talk about truth-telling, first of all, going back to, there was a shift after World War II in the sense of a realization that we as human beings are going to have to wrestle with history. It's not enough to change a government, to change a political regime and expect everything to be smooth and everything to be, we can't forget history. Was this beginning of understanding that countries, like individuals, cannot ignore their past. Psychologically, we understood that individuals need to talk about their past in order to heal. We had never thought that whole nations may need to also do that. And it's controversial. Does a whole country, a whole nation, that needs to be healed? I mean, these are questions we began to ask. And it wasn't, though, until the 1990s, really. I mean, we had the Nuremberg trials to deal with the situation in Germany and the Holocaust. And then after that, in the 80s, skipping a lot of ground, but in the 80s, then things began to pop up. There was various forms of truth, particularly in Central America, as countries were moving away from dictatorial or authoritative regimes, but many were failed. I mean, there was truth came out and truth was dealt with. It was often a very clumsy relationship with the rule of law and a clumsy relationship with those in power. And some of the things that were happening in those truth-telling processes, while the truth was telling people, the people in power who had been the ones causing the harm were often exonerating themselves and giving themselves what we now term blanket amnesty. So you had the folks who were in public positions of power and abusing that power staying in power because there was they could be identified and how should I say? Yeah, identified really in the truth-telling process and taken out of public trust. And so it wasn't until South Africa, really in 1994, that we saw this turning point in the truth-telling, where we had this idea of truth and reconciliation, number one. And number two, South Africa was determined to try to figure out how to bring truth and reconciliation together. It wasn't a perfect process by any means, but they traveled extensively around the world, looking at truth commissions and saying, what can we take the best of these different experiences? And while the South African negotiated political compromise, and the white government and those representing them said, in this transition, we are demanding amnesty or we'll take the country back to war. So in many ways, the Mandela's party and the ANC felt like they had been cornered in a compromise. At the same time, they were determined to think about the people and whether a civil war would be worth. I mean, I think that's that's a rhetorical question. Would that be worth it? And they really felt like they were trapped. So they decided, we're going to look at this idea of amnesty, but we're going to attach conditions to it. In other words, they began to ask the question, how do we maybe amnesty, which is a form of mercy, but with conditions which would hold some accountability to it. And this was the first exercise in that. And their conditions were fairly carefully thought out. They had to prove that they had a political motive. They had to prove that what they did was equal to their motives. In other words, if they're killing children, what is that? Proportionality, we call that in legal terms. They had to tell the truth and put it out in writing and in a statement. And that was investigated and had to be corroborated with other investigations and other stories. And they weren't guaranteed amnesty. If the Amnesty Committee felt like all of these various conditions weren't met, they might not receive amnesty. And what many people don't realize is many of the applicants in South Africa, almost half of them, did not receive amnesty. So it was a rigorous process. And it was a new level of accountability to say, after war and after gross human rights violations, we can hold people accountable with trial and without death penalty and the legal system as we know it. And it also involved what we call lustration or vetting, which was a social kind of exposure. In other words, one of the things that the white apartheid government who was negotiating this process, they wanted this all in camera, which is behind closed doors. And in fact, the ANC said, absolutely not. We will make this a public truth-telling process. And I can vouch for the fact, because I was living in the country, every Sunday night, we had 2 hours or more of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission review, they called it, special. And they had journalists who were following the themes and the stories and the admissions of guilt that were coming out, or not guilt, but the stories and people saying, this is what we did and how we did it. And it was revelational. Yes. For the whole country, yes. Not only those who had been living in hiding and weren't able to talk about their stories. And so we saw a tremendous catharsis happening.
Tell us a little bit more about that. I think that, the fact that this was the first time victims of apartheid were told their stories publicly and be validated. First time all of these horrors that everybody knew were happening come on television, in the newspapers, and I get this. I wasn't there, but I get the sense that the nation was riveted. Yeah. That the first thing people did when they came home from work was to turn on the radio, turn on the television, to see what was the latest in terms of this truth-telling process, this truth and reconciliation. Can you give us a sense? You've already started to give us a sense of how that felt. Yeah.
It was quite incredible. It was. I mean, and I don't want to paint the picture that everyone was on board with it. There was, of course, those who couldn't deal with the level of information. There was those who, after a few years, or maybe a year or a few months, turned it off. And so there was a lot of wrestling with a whole gamut of responses to it. But for the whole of the country, a majority of the country, this was incredible. What was happening and what was being unraveled right in front of them in their screens, their television screens, every week. These were secrets that only the apartheid government and those directly affected knew about. And certainly the Black activists who had survived and had lost family members and had been fighting and struggling against apartheid in the communities and in exile, they couldn't tell their stories except to a few close friends. And they didn't. They suppressed the stories. They held them down. And suddenly you're being catapulted into a public place. And this idea of was incredible. I was at hearings where you have victims who are able to, for the first time, tell their story. It's deeply emotional, but to a group of maybe 300 people, journalists and community and politicians, and who are for the first time listening with empathy and saying, yes, what happened to you never should have happened. It's not a good thing. It's not right. And these reassurances were deeply healing in its own right, just to have that kind of recognition, that kind of dignity restored. And we had many powerful examples of that, where you for the first time heard things. I mean, let me give an example. I was at the hearings for the June uprising, what was called the Soweto Youth Uprising, June 16, 1976. Many people call that a turning point. This is where school children of all ages in uniform were organized and took to a march on the street and wanted to bring a memorandum to the police station in Soweto. And they were blocked by security forces who told them to disband. They refused, but they weren't armed. They weren't threatening. And some of the white security forces unleashed a hail of bullets and literally shooting students who were climbing over fences in the back off of the fence. And so it was a turning point for the world to see the cruelty and the inhumanity of the apartheid system and what it was willing to go to in the sense of killing children. But it was also a turning point for that generation to say, we need to take the struggle from our parents and our grandparents who have struggled, but not hard enough, we don't think. And it really moved the organization within the community to a new level in the society. And even though it was about 14 years till we saw the release of Mandela and so on. But my point being there that I was at a hearing. There's a famous picture that went out through Life magazine of a schoolgirl running beside a young man carrying the first victim. His name was Hector Peterson. Hector Peterson, the young woman running beside him was Hector Peterson's sister. And she was there testifying about that day. And a man carrying Hector Peterson disappeared, and we've never seen him since. But the point is hearing the photographer who took that picture, a well-known photographer in Soweto at the time. And he was taking pictures, many, and he sent them out before they could be stopped by the government. And of course, that got him in trouble, and he never took photographs in the same way politically again. But there he was, this old gentleman saying, I wasn't able to take political photographs after that. And I started to just teach young people about photography in the township in order to stay alive. But he said, I have never received a cent royalty for any of those pictures I've taken. They were snatched up by the international media. And that might be, I mean, you probably wanted to hear something about, the white-black violence and stuff, but that's an example of the kind of truth-telling that happened. And he said, what I want you to do, speaking to Desmond Tutu and the whole commission, is help me get some kind of recognition for the work that I had done over that time. And that was a kind of restitution, a reparation that he was asking for. And so it was these kinds of surprising things that were able to come out in these testimonies. One mother we were working with who became very popular because she found and head up a political, those who were survivors of political violence support group. It was called Kulamani, which in Zulu means speak out. Mm-hmm. She, her son was killed by the violence, and she had his briefcase that he had been running with for a year. He had to run. He couldn't even sleep at home because he was being tracked. And he would come home on surprise visits when she didn't know it and get a meal and give her a kiss and check in and then leave. He couldn't stay long. And she had never opened that briefcase from 86 until 95. And because she didn't have the key and she didn't have the emotional support or felt like she could open that. And it wasn't until she was in the support process during the commission and she had a chance to tell her story that she gathered a group of women, mothers around her closely and went to a locksmith and got a key and opened up his briefcase and went through what was in there. There was the shoes, there was his mug, there was his t-shirt, the latest book, the book he was reading before he was killed. And she was able to go through that and make that ritual. But until then, until that space was opened up, it wouldn't have been possible. So those are just snippets of the kind of emotional energy and catharsis that was happening in the country. And I think as a result, there's very few Americans that can deny that part of our history now. There are those that do for political reasons, but very few that can. This has been established as part of the history of South Africa, good, bad, and ugly. And so this is one example. I don't want to get stuck on South Africa, and there's been many more truth commissions since then, but South Africa's truth has become a sort of pivotal point in this idea of truth and reconciliation work.
Yes, you've talked about the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission unique, because there in the last 40 years or so have been probably close to 40 or so truth and reconciliation processes internationally in South America and Africa. But the South African experience was unique in the ways that you talked about it. I think in the sort of healing impact of the truth-telling a process that was going on, and probably in the way that amnesty was handled, it was unique. And in other ways, and one other way that is very important to me is that for the first time, a Truth and Reconciliation Commission process says restorative justice process.
Yeah, that's right.
In many other prior instances of truth and reconciliation processes, they were coupled with criminal prosecutions, human rights prosecutions, and the idea the idea was really to support prevailing notions of punitive justice in all of the rest of the truth and reconciliation processes. But with the South African process, we began to get a glimpse of a new kind of justice, this more capacious kind of justice that I was talking about earlier. This justice that holds wrongdoers accountable, and this justice that heals, that's both of those. And for me, it makes the South African process really special, not because it was perfect. There are a lot of critics, of course, of the truth and reconciliation process. And I think some of the main criticisms have to do with the fact that hardly any of the reparations that were recommended by the commission were ever actually awarded by the state.
Yeah.
So that these gross economic disparities characterizing apartheid exist to this day. I mean, I don't know if full reparations had been paid, whether that would have dismantled economic apartheid, but that's a criticism that's made. Maybe there was some healing on psychosocial levels, people say, but in the final analysis, the structures of apartheid were not really dismantled.
And I would say some of the structures were. There was a great regional transition that happened when you saw like a human rights commission coming out, community policing, police station, a number of really creative, some of my place in particular, the piece of a place today in.
But these other things that came out of the reconciliation process are not that known, and I think that it's with those up.
Absolutely, I tell folks the truth. Without the institutions, there were many the negotiated agreement to the restitution to the human structures to transition in and of itself cannot put all of its one in many institutions that negotiated transition of this. Fania, I wonder if this is into saying, because I'm looking and some questions coming in with but if you could, there are some really interesting efforts bubbling in the country that are in us in the direction of truth-telling. We had the option and meeting some of the folks doing that, and I wonder if just to get a little bit of sense.
Sure. I do want to talk a little litigation processes that have occurred historically in this country within the last 10 years, just a bit. There's the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Was in the early noughties. Is that what they call them? The early 2000s. And that commission was developed to address what's called the Greensboro Massacre, when in the 70s, the Ku Klux Klan shot into a crowd of demonstrators and killed, I think, 4, and wounded a number of people, black and white. And um, evidence was revealed that showed that the police department knew that the Klan was going to that demonstration and was armed and planned the massacre, yet the police department did nothing about it. And so as a result, Greensboro was still, very wounded and traumatized years later, 25 years later or so. And this is when Reverend Nelson Johnson and the Beloved Community Center came up with the proposal to do a truth and reconciliation process to begin that healing, to help the healing of Greensboro. And they invited Bishop Desmond Tutu. They appointed, using a community selection process, several commissioners. Unfortunately, the city government refused to sponsor the process. Their position was, let's just let bygones be bygones. You're opening old wounds, but those wounds obviously opened and lanced, and so that those wounds could heal. The truth and reconciliation process involved hearings, listening to testimonies of the victims, of some Ku Klux Klan people, of some police officers, of educators, of neighbors who witnessed the incident. Hundreds of witnesses testified at the hearing, and a lot of documentary evidence was reviewed by the commissioners, and the commission issued a report calling for training of police officers, calling for in the local school story, the accurate story about what happened, and calling for a number of other recommendations for structural change. And so that was the first commission in the United States. And of course, Carl, we know that almost all of the other commissions have occurred in countries that are transitioning from very repressive regimes, dictatorships, or apartheid, as in South Africa, into a more representative form of government. And so this Greensboro Commission was the first time we had a truth and reconciliation process and a, quote, established democracy. And then I think the second truth and reconciliation process in this country was the Wabanaki and state of Maine. This was the first time an indigenous tribe, together with a state, had a truth and reconciliation process. That was to address the issue of forced removal of children, and placing them into the foster homes where they were sexually abused, where they were physically abused, where they were not able to speak their language, and they were severed completely. So that commission, I think, may be still going on, or has just ended. And then there have been commissions in Canada, another, quote, established democracy. So that's sort of the backdrop here. So getting to the question that you just raised a moment ago, many people have been calling, in addition to myself, for a truth and reconciliation process to address violence against African Americans, but none is underway as, well, let me say, actually one is just about to start. It was officially launched in January by the Kellogg Foundation, and that's called the Truth, Racial Healing and Transformation Process. And that effort involves probably about 100 organizations around the country, multi-sectorial business organizations, nonprofits, community-based organizations. I'm still learning more about the Kellogg Foundation initiative, but it seems to be a very broad effort, and that it's not singling out violence against African Americans. It's not singling out police violence against African Americans. It's not singling out racism even against African Americans. It's singling out hierarchies, whether we're talking about gender discrimination and oppression, race-based discrimination, economic. So it's a very broad effort. Of course, Kellogg Foundation has been in the forefront of sponsoring and supporting racial healing initiatives in this country. And you asked about the other work that's bubbling up. That's one example that is bubbling up around truth and reconciliation processes. We've got the work of Margaret Burnham at the Northeastern Law School, Northeastern University School of Law. She has established a restorative justice and civil rights project there. And she and her law students go down south and unearth evidence related to cold cases where persons who were killed during the civil rights era because they voted, because they registered to vote, they didn't say yes, sir, or went through the front door instead of the back door. But we know about Medgar Evers, we know about the 4 little girls, and we know about Schwerner, Chaney, and Goodman, but there are so many thousands of others, martyrs of the civil rights movement, that we don't know about. So she and her students are working to honor these unsung heroes, to unearth evidence about what happened to them, and also to bring about community healing. For example, in one case where a young man was killed, I can't remember what the infraction was, but he was killed by a white man who confessed and got a suspended sentence. So there was no way that he could be retried because of double jeopardy. But in this case, more restorative justice and memorialization initiatives were used. The city publicly apologized to the family for the murder. The city also had a ceremony where it renamed a street in his honor, and also installed some plaques in his memory. So this is the kind of work she's doing on a fairly, I think, with hundreds of cases in the South. And she was just with us, as a matter of fact, at a Richmond convening where you were as well, Carl, and there were about 20 or so of us there.
Including representation from the Canadian Truth Commission.
That's right.
Reconciliation Commission. Yeah.
Right. Reverend Nelson Johnson was there, and his wife Joyce Johnson, who were involved in the Greensboro Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And Margaret Burnham was there, a representative from EJI, Equal Justice Initiative, which is the organization founded by just the acclaimed and wonderful civil rights and capital murder attorney, Brian Stevenson. They're doing amazing work. He not only defends mostly Black men who are on death row and saves them from execution, but he has been doing some amazing truth-telling and reconciliation work. And specifically, I'm talking about the reports that he's issued about the lynchings that we didn't know, far more lynchings than we had recorded or documented in a report that was recently released. He also did an incredible report on slavery. And not only have these truth-telling reports been issued, but he is finding the sites where lynchings occurred in Montgomery, and is laying historical markers to honor those who were lost through lynching. Throughout the South, we have thousands of monuments and memorials dedicated to Confederate generals and to slaveholders and people who have lynched, and so few, if any, dedicated to martyrs from lynching or to those who resisted slavery. And Brian Stevenson and the Equal Justice Initiative are changing that. They are laying markers at slave auction sites in Montgomery. Montgomery was one of the largest interstate slave markets, along with Richmond, Virginia. And Brian Steven and the Equal Justice Initiative is also planning. They're designing a lynching museum. That's that was designed by the same architects who worked on the Slavery Museum in Liverpool, on the Genocide Museum in Rwanda, on the Apartheid Museum in South Africa. So he is developing a lynching museum of that caliber right there in Montgomery. He's also developing a slavery museum. And one of the really amazing things about the lynching museum is that he is going to, or has been to sites across the South where there have been lynchings, has collected the soil at those sites and brought them in bottles back to Montgomery, where they are now part of the lynching museum that is in development. Mm-hmm. So that's another example, a really powerful example of truth-telling and reconciliation processes, because when these markers are laid, these historical markers, there is a ceremony. All the community becomes black and white, and that sort of, those ceremonies are achieving a certain amount of community healing. Yeah. So, and then of course there's John Conyers, H.R. 40. He's been introducing that bill for the last, since he's been in Congress, and that's been probably close to 50, maybe 40 or so years. Mm-hmm. This bill, it's called the reparations bill, calls on Congress to establish a commission which would study the feasibility of offering reparations for slavery. And every year, at the beginning of the year, he offers this bill, and it dies in committee. I think now we're at a point in history where we can, change that. I'm hoping.
Yeah.
One of the things that the Kellogg Foundation pointed out is that for the first time historically, the majority of white people now think that racism is a serious problem in this country. And this was based on a study that was just done, I think, in January.
Yeah. Wow. So I'm looking at the time, Fania. If you're interested, shall we segue into some questions? There's a few that have already popped up, and I know there would be lots of questions everywhere. Everything from reparations to what would the structure of this look like. Hopefully, we can get some of those in. I'm going to invite those who've been listening to feel free to send in questions, and we'll try to begin to work with them. The first one that I want to take up, which I think is really important, is from Simone Davis. She's saying, as the Canadian experience suggests, how testimony is collected and what then happens with said testimony seems so important, with the possibility of breaking trust or dishonoring the needs of those who speak of their experiences in the name of research or publicity. Your thoughts about this process, or the process around this? Yeah, the sort of, when does it become exploitative and lose its healing?
Yeah, I think that's a really excellent question. The way you talked about the testimonies of South Africans who were victims, how they felt supported in sharing their stories. I know that the Commission was very solicitous, and they wanted to make sure that there were trauma healers there for persons after they testified. They were very caring in the way that they elicited the testimony and took care of the participants and supported them, and that is so important to me as well. The worst thing that could happen is for a person who has been a victim of some terrible human rights abuse to be victimized again because their stories are not heard even, or because they are treated insensitively. So I think that any process that we do in this country must be very sensitive to the needs of persons who have been so grievously harmed, and create an ambiance, an environment where they feel that they are completely supported and held.
And this is where our work with trauma healing and restorative justice and the intersection would be so important. So that psychosocial support. And I think South Africa also helped to set a precedent in that, though they didn't. I think there was much more that could be done. I think another response, Simone asked the same question: what are your impressions in general of the Canadian truth and reconciliation process? And while I'm not an expert, and I don't know that, Fania, you would call yourself that, not on the Canadian one. We followed it, know some folks who have been involved with it. And I think some of the biggest questions that we hear are still about, so what do we do? How do we follow this process up? In other words, there's these time frames put on it, and then it seems like it's sort of closed. Is there ways in which to spill over into living discussions and impact other generations to come, and get into specific areas of politics and legislation and that sort of thing? And those are all huge questions. I can speak from the South African experience. We certainly had the same issue. We had the entire world descending upon South Africa to do PhDs around the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. I'm being a little bit to the point where, I was getting requests, can you bring a victim and offender together? I said, no, this is not the circus. The circus didn't come to town. Didn't have to find another way to have this conversation. And I think we began to, one of the ways was to begin to say, let us have some input locally into your research. And if you really are interested in this research, let us help shape it so that it's something that can feed back and benefit us as a community in South Africa, or my colleagues as people who were living there and would be affected by. So this wasn't something sort of what we call research hit and run. You get all your information and then you leave and nothing's heard of since then. And I think another example of this is being sensitive to these issues as they come up. One of the things that was beautiful about the South African Truth Commission is there was a point about halfway into the hearings, the victims' hearings, that the women commissioners said, something's very interesting is happening here. And there was someone also doing some research at that point. All of the women who were coming forward to testify were telling stories of their loved ones, not their own story. They were telling stories of their sons, of their fathers, of their brothers, and of their sisters and aunts and uncles, but not their own trauma. And so someone asked why, and that they didn't feel safe yet, even with all the structure that had been set up. So the female commissioners decided to have their own gender-specific hearings, and they had 3 of them, where it was only female commissioners sitting with females in the audience, and then asking women to tell their personal story, the mothers and the grandmothers and the sisters who had suffered so much in this. And it was out of that quite a bit was and quite troubling. In other words, that became then a picture of the gender violence that had happened on all sides of the political divide, including within the liberation struggle, that people weren't politically comfortable to talk about because they were naming people who were now going to be the new political leaders of the country. And so this is the kind of delicacy of this work.
Yeah, and back to whose question was this? Davis? What was
it was Kimberly Davis, yeah. Or no, sorry, Simone Davis.
Simone, yes. I remember Davis because that's my last name. Yeah, so, and Simone, your question about the overall process in Canada, getting back to that, I'm hoping that in this country, when we do launch such a process, that it will not simply be a commission of experts who have been appointed to hear the evidence, to review the documents, and come up with findings of fact and recommendations telling us what to do. In other words, I'm hoping that we don't engage in this kind of top-down process. And because I would say that restorative justice would be, this would be a restorative justice-based process, that means that it would be a more inclusive process. Yeah, we might have a commission of that sort, but a lot of things happening at the community level, participatory processes, encounter processes, circles, healing circles, circles where persons who have caused harm come together with persons causing harm. would be a lot of work happening on local levels by the people. And I think that's what's needed for the deep level of healing that's required in this country. That I.
Yeah, and this folds into another question we have here, Fania. I'm trying to put something together. What are some of the specific steps we need to take now in order to create the process that you speak about, i.e., truth and reconciliation process founded in restorative justice principles to deal with violence against the African American communities? And I hear a call to say, we're at the very initial stages, so it's really hard to describe what we're all trying to imagine. But I think one of the things that's seeming to emerge is to get away from this hierarchy, this national top-down approach, and begin to say, what are the models in which we can link from justice from the bottom up? And there are efforts at truth-telling. There's the Truth-Telling Project in Ferguson, in Baltimore, in St. Louis, in different places where there's already local organizing and processes going. How could we link those? How could we help, open up community? How could we set some rich practice principles that might be able to be helpful to other local communities anywhere across the country who might say, we have a situation. I was just speaking to the mayor in my town that I live in Harrisonburg. He's from Danville, Virginia. There was a racial killing of the level of and civil rights that was just, Danville's too small to have gotten the national attention. It's never been dealt with. Dogs and water and all the things we saw at Selma happened in Danville, Virginia. What would it be like to set up something and start to have a conversation of the descendants of those who were? And so I think from the bottom up, and we'd have to begin to look at ways in which we would define what we're trying to do, and allow the local ownership to define what the outcomes of those kinds of truth-telling processes should entail, with the hope that we can coordinate something there. But that's a big challenge.
Yeah, well, one of the first things that we decided to do after a 2-day convening in Richmond, Virginia, last February, is to do a mapping initiative, map all of the truth-telling type and reparations type and reconciliation type initiatives that are going on around the country. So that's one of the first things that we definitely want to start doing. And another thing that can be done is, if you're looking at, say, what Coming to the Table Project is doing, Coming to the Table and what Tom DeWolf is doing, for example. Tom DeWolf was at that gathering in Richmond. He is a white man who is a descendant of the largest slave owner dynasty, the largest slave-owning family in the U.S., which was based in Rhode Island, I believe. And when he and other members of their family discovered this history as adults, they took action to They told the truth. I hear some sounds. Do you hear strange sounds right now? No? No. But anyway, so Tom DeWolf and his family actually created a film called Traces of the Trade that tells the whole truth about their family's complicity in slave trading. And so Tom and his family members are traveling all over the country with this film and catalyzing racial healing conversation, taking full responsibility and doing everything they can to make amends and take collective action. So there's a woman also who's affiliated with Coming to the Table by the name of Karen Brannon. She is a veteran reporter with CNN, PBS, and she discovered late in life that her grandfather and other 4 parents were involved in slave trading in Columbus, Georgia, and that they presided over lynchings of 3 Black people. So she, as a reporter, an investigative reporter, has done a lot of investigation, has learned about what her family has done, is telling the truth about it, And I think a book is coming out or is already out. So these are some examples of what some of you might be interested in doing, telling the truth. And you can start your own investigations, just as Karen did, just as the DeWolf family did.
And I think, and something else that's happening is in many ways we have to massage the environment to get to the point where we can begin to talk about the truth and sit in that fire of that truth. And I think that's one of our problems. We jump out real quickly and we run away, and there's a lot of fear and there's fear and there's rage that get in the way of. So what would it mean? For instance, here in Harrisonburg, we're talking about why not start having discussion groups, sustained dialogue groups around race issues in our community before we have incidents that have to bring it to the fore in the way in which we've been seeing media. So what would it be like to invite different sector, to invite the police, to invite community, to start having these discussions now and hold them in a container that's regular and there. And there's places where that's been happening. I need to look at some of these other questions here, Fania. There's some really good ones. Hi, Fania and Carl. This comes from Kimberly Cook. Thanks for offering your insights. I'm in Wilmington, North Carolina, and I'm working to build RJ capacity here with good community support. Our history here is racially oppressive, from 1898 to the Wilmington 10 and continuing to current circumstances. What are some good strategies for developing community support for more RJ in general and for TRCs? Thank you. I mean, we've started to talk about that. Maybe you want to add any comment, Fania, to that?
Well, we've been really successful in Oakland starting restorative justice initiatives in the schools. I think schools seem to be particularly open, at least compared to juvenile justice systems, where we've had less buy-in and less financial investment in restorative justice, even though we've had a lot of verbal buy-in. So getting work going in schools is probably a fertile ground to get restorative justice work going in your city. Certain cities have been doing police community healing circles. This has been happening in Austin. This has been happening in Greensboro. This has been happening in Oakland. And it was happening actually in Baltimore before the commissioner who most recently resigned, Batts, just resigned. But before Batts was police commissioner, they were doing police community healing circles. So exploring that. Of course, whoever does this work would need to be trained. Like Kimberly knows that. She's been involved in restorative justice for quite some time. I think getting youth involved is a really important thing, and base community involved in these restorative justice initiatives.
Yeah. Fania, here's another question. Michelle Day asks, is it possible to combine this effort with an effort to have racism and racial violence declared a public health issue?
Absolutely. I think that's being recognized. The field of public health is very clear now that structural violence and structural racism are public health issues. Violence in African American communities are public health issues. And I know that from our own personal experience as a nonprofit organization, there was one big foundation in the state of California that we wanted to get funding, hoped to get funding from, the California Endowment. And some years ago, they denied us funding because they said they only funded health projects. Meaning like school health clinics and those sort of things. And if you were doing that kind of thing, Fania, you could get money from us. But sorry, you're doing this violence prevention. It's important, but it's not considered a health issue. Well, today they're one of our biggest funders because they have expanded their definition of health to include violence prevention.
Yeah, and we know of Cure and some of the interrupters and so on who have been based on this idea that public violence is in fact like an epidemic. We need to think about it as a public health issue, and I think there's some movement in that direction. And I think that would be critical. It's critical for a number of reasons, because not only does it make sense and it helps us think more creatively and out of the box on how to respond, but it also helps us talk about structural issues without taking it into the personal and the interpersonal and say there's a structural issue here. So I think that's important. Fania, we are running close to closing. There's Malik Thompson asked a really important question here. Fania, she says, you spoke a bit about your experience with rage toward white people earlier. Mm-hmm. I'm interested in having you speak more to rage's position within the restorative justice movement, specifically the rage of indigenous people / people of color. How is for rage to be expressed?
That's a very complex question. When we are doing circles where persons harm come together with persons causing harm, it's important for that rage to be expressed before those parties come together, because if it is not, then the circle can be a conflagration. It can be, it can fail miserably because of anger, because even there's a possibility even of physical altercation. So when we bring people into restorative spaces where persons causing harm are brought, it's important that those destructive emotions, it's important that they've gone beyond that they have aired those. I'm not at all advocating that we hold those emotions in. I'm all for expressing them and purging oneself if possible, especially before coming into a healing space. Mm-hmm. I learned that my anger was only adding to the collective consciousness of anger. And I learned that it's important to model the changes that we want to see in the world. That if we want to see a more peaceful world, if we want to see a more healing world, it's important for me to model that healing way of being. We are a culture that harms people who harm people to show that harming people is wrong, presumably. That's the basis of our justice system. We call it the retributive justice system. So, when we harm people who harm people, we're setting into motion this vicious cycle of harm and all of the with that. And because harm people, if they are not healed, go on to harm other people or homes. So restorative justice really seeks to heal that harm instead of responding with more harm. We believe that history is asking us to learn to be good at healing. We all know how to be very good at harming, very good at destroying, very good at hurting, whether it's other people, family members, community members, or the earth, or our waters. So restorative justice is really seeking to transform this harm, this anger, this rage, so that we can really become a people that heal, families that heal, communities that heal. Otherwise, we won't have a future.
I think that's a beautiful note to stop on and move us into the next section. Maybe just to say, I think, and there's one last question here that talks about microaggressions and even the very structures of truth and reconciliation commissions, that racism can be built in the very structures in which we are trying to heal, and people can be marginalized, people can be harmed, people can be silenced, and so it's complex work we're wading into, which is the reason why in history folks haven't wanted to wade into this, I think. And I think, you might want to comment on that, but I mean, I think in this process, we have to keep thinking about how do the structures also lend themselves to healing and not to further aggression and further marginalization and further trauma.
Absolutely. We need to put a lot of thought and heart into that, into creating these nurturing spaces, these healing spaces, these respectful spaces. And that goes to the question that was just answered by, or that was just asked by the young person, or by the person earlier, about rage, If we don't create these kinds of spaces that are respectful and that are caring and that are nurturing, we will only increase the rage in our culture. Yeah.
Wow. Thank you very much, Fania, for your time. I know you're very busy. Taking this hour and a half out of your time is really a valuable gift to the folks who've stayed with us. This has been a really rich discussion, as is clear. There's much more to feel and embody and talk about in the future, and we hope that this opens up some conversations for those who've been able to participate in your own local communities. We're going to turn it over to talk a little bit about other opportunities to engage in this kind of conversation, as well as other conversations, and I will just note the one being this summer at our Summer Peacebuilding Institute. Fania and I will be co-teaching a 5-day course on this very subject matter, truth-telling, restorative justice, and reconciliation. So strongly encourage anyone who wants to take this conversation deeper to join us. Thank you, and we'll turn it over to Sarah.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Carl and Fania. So just a few announcements. Once again, hello, my name is Sarah King. I'm a graduate student here at the Center for Justice and Peacebuilding in Harrisonburg, Virginia. I work as the graduate assistant for the Zehr Institute, and I have a couple of announcements for upcoming events. So first, if this feels, there we go. Our last webinar of this spring is on April 20th. 4:30 to 6 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And the topic is, can restorative justice address structural and racial violence or injustice in neuroscience perspective? And Howard Zehr will be hosting that, so please feel free to register and sign up for that webinar if you'd like to see it. And we will be recording those and posting them on the website as well, as we always do. We also have a conference coming up, Restorative Justice in Motion, Building a Movement, June 14th through 17th. And it's gonna be really fantastic. I'm very excited about it. There's gonna be a nice youth component attached to that as well. So hopefully we have all sorts of people coming to that. It will be in Harrisonburg, Virginia. And if you have any questions or interested in registering, the email is at the bottom of this slide. We also have the Summer Peacebuilding Institute. It's a 4-week intensive during May and June, offering 20 different courses. If you're interested in taking any of them, there's a way to sign up at the bottom of the slide, but there's also a few of them on restorative justice. Carl already mentioned the truth-telling, reconciliation, and restorative justice, but we also have strategies for trauma-informed organizations and foundations of restorative justice being offered. Foundations for restorative justice is going to be new, an online course offered in the fall, as well as during SPI. So if you're interested in taking advantage of that, please contact Sarah Rothshank, who is our admissions director here at CJP. We also have STAR, which stands for Strategies for Trauma Awareness and Resilience. It is a research-based training program that brings together theory and practices from neurobiology, conflict transformation, human security, spirituality, and restorative justice to address the needs of trauma-impacted individuals and communities. This program is great for individuals and organizations whose work brings them into contact with populations dealing with current or historic trauma. There are several opportunities to receive STAR trainings. Currently, there are 2 level 1 trainings and 2 level 2 sessions scheduled for the remainder of 2016. So if you're interested in any of these 4 opportunities, please feel free to register at our website. We also have a graduate certificate in restorative justice. It is a certificate for 18 credit hours with equal focus given to conflict analysis and practice, restorative justice studies, and electives which could focus on monitoring evaluation, psychosocial trauma, or whatever you so choose. The certificate can be completed through a number of courses offered through the annual SPI or through a combination of one semester on campus and one summer term. We also have restorative justice in education. There are 2 tracks for this. You can have a concentration of that within a master's in education, or there's also a 15 credit hour graduate certificate. And then lastly, we have a master's in conflict transformation. It is a 45 credit program, 24 of which are given to core classes, and the rest you can elect to focus on 1 or more areas of interest. The curriculum is practice-based and ideal for individuals looking to be reflective practitioners within their chosen field. And we also have a new website for the Zehr Institute, so please go and take a look at that. We have different opportunities and resources available, as well as past recordings of webinars that you can access if you would like. So that concludes my announcements, and here is Carl for closing comments.
Thank you, Sarah, and once again, thank you very much, Fania Davis. It was really wonderful to have you and have this conversation. I appreciated that. And for all of you who joined us, thank you. From the Zehr Institute, we at the Zehr Institute want to continue to be a convening space for critical and frontier issues, as we say it, and we want to convene both virtually and otherwise. And so we appreciate those who have taken part in our webinar series and invite you to continue to do so and tell others. I think I'll leave with this, and this takes us back to the continent of Africa. One of the many wisdom proverbs that I often heard in Africa, my 16 years there, was our history is always before us. That didn't mean that we had to live in the history. It meant that we couldn't run away from the history, that history would cycle back. And we could learn both positive things from those who went before us, as well as we had to learn the difficult and challenging and painful parts of history, learn from them. And it reminds us that our history is important. And I think that's what this whole discussion is about. How can we heal the harms of history? And so on that note, thank you and have a good evening or day, whichever part of the country you are zooming in from. And we'll see you next time, next month at the next webinar. Thank you and goodbye.